Yes, and welcome to this week's episode of the Practical SQL Server HADR show. My name is Edwin Sarmiento, and welcome. If this is the first time that you are joining in, welcome. Say hi if you're on Twitter or LinkedIn, because sometimes people would comment or say hi. Now we're seeing people joining in. Welcome, everyone. Say hi. Welcome. If this is the first time you're joining in, I do these every week, Friday to be exact. I started doing these earlier this year, where the goal is to help SQL Server DBAs and sysadmins who are responsible for SQL Server always on availability groups, in particular, any SQL or more generally, anything that has something to do with SQL Server high availability and disaster recovery. It just so happened that most of the SQL Server DBAs nowadays are more focused on availability groups when it comes to high availability solutions. And I started off doing AMA sessions where people would submit questions using the form in the section below, where they would submit questions. And this is a deviation from what I've done for a couple of weeks of answering questions and talking about topics that really impact and affect SQL Server DBAs and sysadmins, anybody responsible for dealing with SQL Server always on availability groups. In particular, the challenges that they face, because the reality is you're dealing with a very expensive, very complex, very complicated infrastructure, and it's challenging not knowing what you're doing. So this is all about it, and I help SQL Server DBAs, sysadmins have the confidence to deal with designing, implementing, and or managing a SQL Server always on available group. So welcome. Today's topic, again, I started looking at some of the questions that were submitted in the past. For the past, by now it's about 12 weeks now. I've looked at the questions and I looked at the quality of the questions. As a data professional, we get to look at the data and come up with insights based on the data we have. And it's easy for me to kind of figure out the level of expertise, the education, the technical competence, the background of the person asking the question based on the quality of the question submitted. And this is not just common in the people who submitted the questions, but also in, now it's almost 12 years, no, 10 years now, ever since SQL Server Always On Available Groups was released. And in the past, when Windows Server failover clustering together with SQL Server failover clustered instances have been deployed, I mean, when you start to think about it, SQL Server failover clustered instances were introduced in SQL Server 7. That's how long it has been. Running on Windows NT4 Wolfpack back in those days. I don't know what the code names are for the Windows Server failover clustering platform nowadays. Anyway, and today's topic is something that I find sometimes funny, but sometimes also frustrating. And the title of today's session is all about the art. And of course, I like acronyms. That's why I threw in the A.R.T. there. The art of dealing with a crappy environment that you just inherited. And it's interesting, though. When I look at an environment, and I talk to the people managing that environment, there's only two possible reasons for why that environment is there. Number one, the person that I was talking to was the one who built it. And two, he was the one managing it, but somebody else built it, right? And this could be a couple of different reasons. One, it was a former DBA, a former sysadmin who built the infrastructure, and then he left for greener pastures, not realizing that it is more challenging. So either a former DBA, a former sysadmin who used to work for that company, and then he left, no documentation, nothing. Or two, a consultant, managed services provider came in, built it, and had somebody else take care of it. Usually it's the person in-house, meaning the full-time DBA taking care of it. And it's really frustrating when you're dealing with a crappy environment. Somebody handed you something and now you're responsible for it, not realizing that, whoa, there's so much crap going on. The fact that you now have to deal with it, in addition to you getting blamed for it because now you're responsible for it. Crappy situation that is, because you now have to deal with it and you also get blamed for it. That's why I call this the art of dealing with a crappy environment that you just inherited. And this could apply to any SQL Server high availability solution. Could be database mirroring. I threw in database mirroring in there because it's still supported. It's deprecated, still supported. Failover clustered instances, availability groups, what have you. Any SQL Server high availability and disaster recovery solution is going to be your responsibility as a SQL Server DBA. And it's very easy to fall into the trap of blaming. And I hear this a lot when I talk to the in-house DBA or the in-house sysadmin who's now responsible for this. And when I ask them about the environment, it's all blaming. Yeah, the guy who left, he dealt with this, and now I'm now responsible for the crap that he did. Or there's finger pointing. Yeah, it's his fault, and now I get the blame for it. And I kind of understand where you're coming from because, again, nobody wants to be blamed for something that they did not do, and nobody wants to be taken care of something that they have no clue about. The fact that they didn't leave any documentation, they didn't tell you how it works, they did not even do a proper handover. The environment is just one of the crappy things that you have to deal with. You have to deal with the crappy comments, the blaming and all that. So I want you to first set the intention of clear any negative intent. And what I mean by this is, if you want to not just be able to take control and stabilize and make sure that your high availability solution is running smoothly with very minimal to almost no headaches, no issues, is I want you to start with the intent that you are going to thrive. And what I mean by this is, again, every time I come into a customer environment and somebody else built it, it's like, I don't even know what's going on here. Somebody else built it and it's his fault, and I'll have to take care of this crap. Stop and avoid the temptation to be finger pointing or blaming. And I hear this a lot. And my typical response to this is, well, he had to do what he needed to do given the resources that he had and the experience that he had. He did what he thought was right when he needed to do it. And we cannot blame him for it because that's what he did was right at that point. You cannot blame a 5-year-old for not paying his taxes because the 5-year-old does not have any clue about paying taxes. That does not make the 5-year-old less of a person, right? And so again, I want you to come into this with the intent to thrive. You're going to turn this around, you're going to solve the problem, and stop the blame. Stop the finger pointing. I just needed to say that because, again, it's a common theme that I'm hearing from people taking care of this. And again, it's not easy. Here you go, take care of this, fix the problems. You don't know what to do. You don't have any documentation. You don't have a clue how the person did it, but now you're responsible for it. Let me get on with the art, the A.R.T. of dealing with a crappy environment that you just inherited. And I like using acronyms because it's easy to remember, okay? The first A on this, and like I said, I just want to Lead with that. Set the intention to thrive, focus on solving the problem, stop the blaming, stop the finger pointing, focus on solving the problem. Okay. Focus on the goal. First, in the A.R.T of dealing with a crappy environment is assess. Just like when you want to figure out what is wrong, you want to do an assessment. And you could do manual checks, you can do automated checks. But the thing is, in order for you to really figure out what is causing a lot of these issues, you start off with an assessment. You have some of the tools available out there from Microsoft, the best practices analyzer, right? You can use that to do your assessment. And by doing an assessment, you will be able to figure out the issues that are causing, or rather the either the misconfiguration, the settings that are causing the issues. Because again, you want to solve those issues, you want to eliminate them as much as possible so that your availability or high availability solution is stable, reliable, highly available, resilient, and you don't have to worry about it. Okay, so assessment is the first thing. Use the Microsoft best practices recommendation as your starting point. And I say starting point because, well, Microsoft's environment is not necessarily the same as yours. Microsoft's resources are not necessarily the same as yours. Their technical expertise, their budget, by the way, they don't have to pay for license. That's one thing. Is not the same as yours. So use the Microsoft best practices as a starting point for your assessment. Okay? Don't just jump into the conclusion that just because something does not meet the Microsoft best practices doesn't mean it's wrong. I'll use a very simple example. One of my mistakes early on in my career was when I noticed that a customer environment that I was doing an assessment on had database files on the C drive. Now, you would read a ton of Microsoft documentation that says, don't put your databases on the C drive. And I was almost tempted to say, move your databases away from your C drive. And the good thing about it is I know how to ask questions. And I asked, so why are your databases on the C drive? And that's when they told me it's kind of like their standard. It's actually not on the C drive, but rather on a mount point, which technically isn't on the C drive. It's on a very expensive all-flash array running on a storage area network. So it's technically not on a C drive. And so use Microsoft best practices. Use that as a starting point, a reference, so that you can have a baseline of what is good and what isn't. Okay, do your assessment. Best practices analyzer is there. There are tools available. You can do it as an automated thing. Quick shout out to the people responsible for DBA tools. They have created an amazing toolkit for automating a lot of the SQL Server administration stuff, particularly the DBA checks module for checking a lot of these things that are according to Microsoft best practices. Quick shout out to the people who contributed to the community project. I use the HADR checks for DBA checks on my always on available groups. And the thing about this is it allows me to see a quick overview of what is going on, some of the configuration settings that don't fall into Microsoft recommended best practices. And it allows me to have quick wins. I target the low-hanging fruits. Some of the things that I can immediately address, some issues that I can immediately address without causing some issues or potentially causing an outage or even scheduling maintenance windows. Okay, but assessment is just the first A. I actually have two A's in the A.R.T. The second A in the the second part of the assessment is awareness. Because here's the thing, though. It doesn't matter if you can run all of these assessments if you don't know exactly what they are there for. And in general, though, It's kind of hard to do an assessment if you're not aware that there's something wrong. It's just common sense. You cannot do an assessment if you're not even aware that there is something wrong. Or if you're doing an assessment, you're not aware of why this specific check or why this specific configuration is a best practice or not. So these two go hand in hand. I mean, it doesn't matter if, a great, I'm just using the car analogy here. It does make sense for the mechanic to just do an assessment if the owner is not aware that there is a problem. Because in the first place, if the owner is not aware that there is a problem, he or she is not even going to take it to the mechanic, and no assessment is going to happen. Typically, the awareness comes first before the assessment. Okay? So that's the A in the A.R.T. I should have done A.A.R.T. But that's the A in the art of dealing with a crappy assessment. That's the first step. You got to do an assessment, but before you can even do an assessment, you got to be aware. I mean, even when you're running some automated checks, like for instance, you decide to run DBA tools, and you decide, I want to run DBA checks, I want to use the HADR checks for this. If it spits out a report of the assessment, but you're not aware of what they are, I mean, what is this check for? If you're not aware of what these checks are, then there's no point of doing the assessment because you're not going to be able to do anything about them. Okay, so start with assessment, and the only way that you can do an assessment is if you are aware of the issues and what those checks are in order for you to do the right assessment. So that's the first one, A. R, I'm going to make it easy for you, and just make sure that you are taking notes. R stands for request. There's no point in learning something and not doing anything about it. There's no point in realizing that you have a problem, but you're not going to be doing anything about it. This is one of the things where I tell people, information is useless, because when people talk about, information and knowledge is power, I don't believe that. I believe that power comes from taking action on the very few information that you have. You can memorize the entire Wikipedia and not do anything about it, then it's useless. So R stands for request. This is where you start requesting for change. And there's a reason why I emphasized on the request. You don't go ahead and just do some modifications or make some changes to the environment without proper change management process. And I'm huge in change management process because because primarily there's a reason why you have an always on availability group solution, or there's a reason why you have a high availability solution. You want it to be highly available, you want it to be stable, reliable, resilient, and so we want to minimize risk as much as we possibly can. Any change you introduce to a system could potentially cause an unexpected behavior. And that unexpected behavior could potentially cause unexpected risks. That's why I am a big fan. Hopefully you are, or you do have a change management process in place. So R is for request, okay? And the thing about requesting for change is that because you now have a list of the things that you have identified as part of your assessment, you can now schedule a change management request to make modifications to those things. And I usually start off with the low-hanging fruit. Anything that I can modify, anything that I can change that would lead me to a stable environment without affecting or without causing major issues. Like it doesn't require a downtime. It doesn't require a maintenance window. So I start off with those things, right? And then progress until I know that I have addressed everything that I've identified in the assessment part. Now, requesting for change and making the change is easy. However, the reason I consider this the most challenging piece of the A.R.T, like the art, is because of internal politics. I hate to say this because in most cases, you have to deal with people. And I use the example of a multi-node, multi-replica, multi-availability group setup. I'll just use a simple example. A 3-node failover cluster with a 3-replica availability group, each one running a primary replica. Maybe one AG is running on node 1, one AG is running on node 2, one AG is running on node 3. And these availability groups are owned by different business units and stakeholders. Requesting for change means you have to convince the stakeholders, the business unit owners, on the merits of making those changes. And like I said in the beginning, like I said earlier, it's one of the most challenging parts of the A.R.T, not because of how you do the work, but because of how you need to get those approvals, right? So in that example of a 3-node failover cluster with a 3-replica AG, where one AG, each node will have its own primary AG, is if a change would require a downtime and you have to fail over availability groups from one node to another, and you have to request for an approval, sometimes getting them to agree on a maintenance window is even more challenging. So you have to use your powers of convincing in order to even get an approval for a change that is really, really necessary. So you've gone from doing an assessment, you've identified based on the assessment the things that you need to modify, you submitted a request for change, and now you're waiting. You're waiting. Again, the challenge has nothing to do with doing the work. It has everything to do with the approval, with the person saying yes to the change that you're about to make, right? And then they would argue, no, mine is, our databases are more important than yours, so we cannot do the maintenance windows alongside. It's, again, the internal politics sometimes is very challenging. I wish we would just request for change from a machine, which would just say yes or no. But sometimes they would argue on the merits of whether they're more important. And of course, everyone feels like they're more important, so their databases are more important than the rest of the world. That's why it's on an available group. Anyway, so R stands for request. You request for the change. Getting all the people involved, the people who need to approve, and part of this is treating this like a project, even if it's a simple change. And the reason for that is because you have to be prepared when you submit your request. Again, taking an item from your assessment, making modifications to the system based on the outcome of the assessment. And part of what you include in your change management request is what are the steps that you need to do in order to make this change? What are the risks? Do you have a backup plan? Do you have a rollback plan? The reason I say that you have to treat this as an upgrade or as a project is because, again, we are trying to minimize the risk. We cannot eliminate the risk. We can just minimize it. So what happens if, as you are making changes to this, based on the results of your assessment, all of a sudden the availability group comes offline or the failover cluster becomes unavailable? You have to know how to deal with that, because there's no guarantee that whatever you're doing is going to be 100% foolproof. We're humans. We make mistakes, right? So include in your change management request not just the steps to do the work, step-by-step process, but what will be your risk assessment. What are the risks if something happens? What could be the potential risk if you make this modification? How would you roll back? And part of that is also planning, because let's say, for instance, you requested for a 2-hour maintenance window. You have to factor in what happens if you need to roll back. So that's going to be 2 plus another 2 hours if that's how long it takes for you to roll it back. Again, this is a bigger part of what I'm emphasizing when it comes to requests. or the R part of this, because I'm huge in change management process. I'm huge, regardless of whether you are more of a DevOps team, you have this culture of being agile and implementing. It doesn't matter. In a highly available solution, like an always on available group or a failover clustered instance, you want to minimize risk. And the way to minimize risk is to minimize changes to the system. That is very important. So you have to include what risks are involved, what is the impact to the system, the steps that you need to take, the rollback plan in case something you need to do, in case something happens, right? That is part of your request. Didn't I say that this is the challenging piece of the A.R.T, of dealing with a crappy environment? If you've inherited it, it's fine. Someone else built it, someone else configured it, I just have to deal with it. It's more challenging when you are the one who built it, you didn't build it the way it's supposed to be built, and now it's scrappy and you have to take full responsibility for it. It's taking the blame for the things that you've done. That's why I said it's challenging, because now you are taking full responsibility for something that you built. But of course, we're talking about something that you've inherited here. So that might not be the case if you've simply inherited it. Yeah, it is challenging. If you're the one who built it, it ended up being crappy, and you tell the people at the top of the organization, yeah, it was my fault. That is tough. T, yeah, we talked about A, which is assessment and being aware. R stands for request, requesting for that change. T stands for tweak. And I specifically use the word tweak because I want you to be very intentional about the changes that you will implement. Like I said at the beginning, I would usually look at, based on the outcome or the result of the assessment, I would usually look at the changes that have very minimal to no impact. Meaning I don't need a downtime, I don't need a maintenance window, I can deal with it without having to take down the available group or the failover clustered instance. Because again, if I had to, that's an outage. And if there are certain consequences of having an outage, I am so not going to introduce any outage. So tweak. You have to look at what are you changing, and you don't change everything at the same time. I find when people do assessments like, these are 10 things that I found out in my assessment, let's go and do all these 10 things. No, you don't. Like I said, minimize changes to minimize impact. We don't want to cause risk. We don't want to cause any unexpected behavior. So you submit a change request for one change, measure, and here's the thing though. In order for you to constantly make those changes, you have to really prove that what you changed actually solve a problem. There's no point in making modifications. One example here is when people say, oh, does the file allocation unit, NTFS unit size, I forgot the exact term, does it have to be 64K? I mean, the reality is that's going to take a lot of work. And what would be the impact? Is it going to be huge? Right? So tweak, start with small changes first, and then you measure. You don't just change and not measure, because now you don't have any proof that what you did actually mattered. Come up with a baseline. How was the behavior before this change, and how was the behavior after? I'll give you a very simple example. VLFs with SQL Server, virtual log files. The number of virtual log files will impact the failover time, the amount of time it takes to failover the entire availability group, because the more virtual log files you have, the longer it is going to take for SQL Server to fail over to the secondary replica, and it will affect your recovery time objective. Now, you can measure that. Of course, I don't recommend that you just fail over just to measure the benefits of reducing the VLFs, but it is a simple example where you measure the change, or you measure the before and after, right, after the change is done, so that you have now an evidence, proof that, hey, this thing that I did actually improved performance, improved efficiency, improved reliability and resiliency. Now we go ahead and move on with the next change. Now it's easier to get the approval for the next request, right? And again, baseline, if you're not measuring baseline, if you're not measuring the impact of what you're doing, people would ignore, right? You got to have proof that what you're doing is actually something that makes a difference. And the challenge here is have the temptation to always be, okay, I've done this, let's move on to the next one. No, make the change, measure, submit the other one. And again, it's tempting to just implement all of the changes at the same time, because now at least you can say, hey, I'm done, moving on, right? It takes time. You have to be very patient with this. And that's why I specifically use the word tweak. Small changes, measure before and after, and then you move on to the next change until you end up in a place where no more issues. My availability group, my failover clustered instance is stable, it's reliable. And the only way, of course, to prove that is have a monitoring tool in place and measure what are the issues for a specific period of time. And then you compare that before all of these changes were made. And it's interesting because, again, the goal is to make sure that you have a stable, reliable, resilient, highly available solution, to a point where you kind of set and forget. I have a ton of customers where they would tell me, sometimes we don't even remember that we have an available group in place until we have to install some cumulative updates, because they don't touch it anymore. They don't get paged, they don't get alerted, they don't get phone calls about an outage. It's stable, kind of like a set and forget. Okay, so those are the three things that I wanted to share with you on how to deal with a crappy environment that you just inherited. Start with A, assess. Do your assessment. Check, is this something that is according to Microsoft best practices? Again, best practices are just a starting point. You have to have your own best practices, but at least you have some references of what is the right way and how to properly configure an always-on availability group or a failover clustered instance. And of course, after you made the assessment, you come up with the outcome, you come up with a list of things that you need to change, then you move on to the next thing, which is R, request. You need to submit a request for change, get it approved, treat it as a project, have a form that lists all of the things that you need to do, assessment of the risk, backup plan, and a rollback plan, so that you know when the time comes for you to implement the change, if it's successful or not, and if it's not, you know how to roll back, and you still meeting your recovery objectives. T stands for tweak. Small changes, incremental changes, and then you baseline. What was the behavior before and what was the behavior after? This is what will make it easy for you to request for the next change, which also gives you the credential, the credibility to say, hey, I've done a great job. It's not guessing, because now you have proof. This is how it behaved before. I made this change. This is how it behaved after. We made improvements. Let's move on. It will take a couple of weeks sometimes, depending on how large the environment is. It will take some time, depending on how quickly those approvals will come in. It will take some time, depending on how crappy the environment really is. But as you move along, you are making progress in making sure that your availability group or failover clustered instance is the way you want it to be. And the way I measure this, how much downtime did I have for the past month? And I measure this. In fact, I started doing this more than a decade ago, when one of my clients would say, we want to measure the downtime. And we literally measure times when SQL Server was stopped and restarted, and we count that. This is the goal. if you've inherited a crappy environment and you now have to take care of it, use the A.R.T. Assess, request for change, and then tweak until, and you got to do this again as an iterative process, because naturally systems will evolve. You would have to introduce new changes, not necessarily on anything that would affect the availability group or the failover clustered instance, but just part of the evolution and the life cycle of the entire application. So you do the same thing. You assess, you request, and then you tweak. But like I said in the beginning, it is very difficult for you to make an assessment if you are not aware of what you need to do an assessment on. You won't be able to do an assessment in the first place if you don't know how the availability group infrastructure works. You don't know what makes an availability group healthy. You don't know what happens, why an automatic failover is triggered. It is very difficult to prevent risks from happening in the first place if you're not aware of what could potentially cause those risks, what could potentially cause an outage. Even so, it is very difficult, and you won't be able to make an assessment if you don't know how Windows Server failover clustering works, right? Awareness is the key in order for you to do the A.R.T. Yes, so awareness is the key in order for you to do an assessment, a request, and then the tweak. And that's where I come in. I can help you become really aware of what risks are, what could potentially cause even more issues down the road. I kind of look at it like a snowball effect of small issues that build up over time until eventually, a perfect storm takes out the entire infrastructure, and now you're down for like hours, right? Like I said, you start off with becoming aware, and this is where I come in. If you need any help with anything related to SQL Server, always on availability groups or failover clustered instance, and you don't know where to start, and you're just being handed this very complex architecture that you now have to be responsible for, and you don't have any clue, and you're spinning your wheels trying to figure out, where do I start? What do I do? Use that link on the screen to schedule a strategy session with me. Book a time. This would lead you to my calendar where you could pick a time that works for you. And in the call, in the conversation, we're going to get crystal clear on exactly what your challenges are, what is causing issues in your availability group or your failover clustered instance. We're going to do a quick assessment of the real problems, and then we'll come up with a step-by-step strategy on how to resolve those issues. And I can guarantee you it's going to be the best 45 minutes to an hour worth of time you've ever invested in making sure that taking care of a crappy environment no longer has to be a part of your day-to-day, right? So use that link on the screen, schedule a call, and let's have that conversation. I can guarantee you it is going to make your life a lot easier, right? That's about it. Talking about the A.R.T. of dealing with a crappy environment that you just inherited. Join me again next week for another topic. Make sure that you get notified. I'm not quite sure how that works with Twitter or LinkedIn. YouTube has this subscribe thing. But if you want to know more about the upcoming schedules, or topics rather, it will be posted on the timeline of my LinkedIn, Twitter, and YouTube profiles. If you have any questions on anything related to SQL Server high availability and disaster recovery, there should be a link to a form where you can submit those questions so I can answer them in future sessions like this, right? Again, enjoy the rest of your, I can say weekend because it's Friday. Enjoy the rest of your weekend, and I will see you again next week